The storm arrived the same night Duke Lucien Mordain realized he could no longer read his own empire. Standing alone in his war chamber while rain hammered against stone walls thick enough to withstand siege cannons, the man who had dominated the northern territories for a decade stared at military correspondence that might as well have been written in a dead language. Every symbol mocked him. Every coded instruction sat there like a locked door he'd never noticed until now. Outside these walls, noble houses still whispered his name with careful respect, but inside this room, surrounded by maps marking victories he could no longer explain, Lucien finally understood what absolute power felt like when the machinery underneath it stopped working. His wife had been gone for 3 days, and his empire was already collapsing. If you want to see how a man built on borrowed brilliance destroys himself one catastrophic decision at a time, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments and smash that like button because this story gets darker than you think. 5 years earlier, before everything turned to ash and regret, Lucien Mordain stood in the grand hall of Blackthorn Castle, watching 300 guests pretend they weren't terrified of him. The occasion was his wedding. The bride was Lady Evelyn Ashford, daughter of a minor noble house from the eastern provinces. 23 years old with dark hair pulled back so severely it looked painful, gray eyes that rarely met anyone's directly, and the kind of quietness that made people forget she was in the room. Lucien had chosen her precisely for that quietness. He was 31 then, already Duke of Blackthorn after his father's sudden death 2 years prior, already legendary for crushing the Westmarch Rebellion with tactics so brutal the surviving enemy commanders begged for execution rather than captivity. He needed a wife. The kingdom expected it. But he did not need another voice competing for attention in a life already crowded with his own magnificence. Evelyn seemed perfect, decorative enough to avoid embarrassment, plain enough to avoid distraction, intelligent enough to manage the household staff without bothering him about petty domestic concerns. He spoke to her exactly 4 times before the wedding. The ceremony was efficient, the vows were traditional. Evelyn's voice barely carried past the first row of guests when she promised to honor and obey him. Lucien remembered thinking that was exactly how a proper wife should sound. Afterward, during the reception, General Hartwick approached him near the dessert tables with a glass of wine and a concerned expression that immediately annoyed Lucien. "Your father used to say, 'A strong duke needs a clever wife,'" the general said carefully. "A partner who can see the battlefield from different angles." Lucien smiled the way he always smiled when older men offered unsolicited wisdom. "My father also believed in mercy, Hartwick. Look where that philosophy left him, dead at 58 with half the northern houses plotting against him." The general said nothing else. Across the hall, Evelyn stood beside a marble column in her silver wedding gown, alone, watching the celebration like someone studying a play they weren't actually part of. A servant offered her champagne. She declined with a small shake of her head. Lucien noticed this and immediately forgot it. He was busy accepting congratulations from men who controlled armies and trade routes and border fortifications. Their praise felt like warm honey poured directly into his veins. Every handshake reinforced what he already knew about himself, that he was exceptional, that he was destined for greatness, that he had earned everything through his own brilliance. The first 6 months of marriage confirmed his expectations perfectly. Evelyn ran the household with invisible efficiency. Meals appeared perfectly timed. The castle staff operated smoothly without drama. Social obligations were managed without requiring his attention. She attended state dinners when necessary, wore appropriate gowns, spoke rarely, and never contradicted him in public. At night, she was available when he wanted her and absent when he didn't. This seemed like the ideal arrangement. Then came the crisis at Thornridge Pass. A surprise winter offensive from the Solmire Empire threatened to cut through the northern defenses before spring reinforcements could arrive. Military commanders sent urgent dispatches demanding immediate strategic direction. The king himself wrote personally requesting Lucien's tactical assessment within 48 hours. Lucien spent 3 days locked in his war chamber surrounded by maps and intelligence reports, trying to formulate a response that matched his reputation. Nothing came. Every approach felt obvious. Every strategy contained fatal vulnerabilities. The pressure built like water behind a cracked dam until he could barely think through the noise of his own inadequacy. On the 4th morning, he woke to find a leather portfolio sitting on his desk. Inside was a complete tactical analysis, supply routes, troop movements, deception strategies, political considerations, everything laid out in meticulous detail using the Blackthorn cipher, the military code system his father had developed decades earlier. The plan was brilliant, more than brilliant. It was the kind of strategic thinking that ended wars before they truly started. Lucien read through it twice, searching for flaws, finding none. At the bottom of the final page, written in elegant handwriting he didn't recognize, was a single sentence. Present this to the king before noon. He found Evelyn in the castle library an hour later, reading beside the tall windows overlooking the eastern cliffs. She looked up when he entered. Her expression revealed nothing. "Did you write this?" he asked, holding up the portfolio. "Yes." "How?" "Your father's old journals are in the archive room. The cipher system isn't as complicated as people believe. The Thornridge situation has 6 possible resolutions, but only one that protects our supply lines while forcing Solmeyer to overextend. The weather patterns favor defensive positioning for the next 3 weeks. Their commander is aggressive but predictable." She delivered this assessment the way someone might describe the weather. Lucien stared at her. "Why didn't you say anything? You didn't ask." He presented the Thornridge strategy to the king that afternoon. The plan worked flawlessly. Within 2 months, Solmeyer forces withdrew in embarrassment. Lucien's reputation as a military genius solidified across the entire kingdom. And late at night, in the privacy of his thoughts, he made a decision that would eventually destroy everything. He decided Evelyn's assistance was convenient. Nothing more. After Thornridge, a pattern developed. Military problems would arrive. Lucien would struggle quietly. Solutions would appear on his desk, written in Evelyn's precise handwriting. He would present them as his own work. Everyone would celebrate his brilliance. The system functioned smoothly for years. At court gatherings, generals praised his tactical innovations. Noble houses competed for his strategic counsel. The king appointed him Lord Commander of the Northern Territories before his 35th birthday. Evelyn attended these celebrations wearing gray gowns, standing at the edges of ballrooms, speaking to almost no one. Lucien told himself she preferred it that way, that she was naturally retiring, that her contributions were simply part of a wife's duty to support her husband. He never asked if she wanted recognition. He never considered that intelligence without acknowledgement might feel like suffocation. He never wondered what accumulated silence might eventually produce. Meanwhile, inside Blackthorn Castle, Evelyn worked through nights that stretched until dawn broke purple over the northern mountains. She studied military history. She decoded enemy intelligence. She drafted contingency plans for conflicts that hadn't even started yet. The servants noticed her lamplight burning in the library at 3 a.m. Hipots. They whispered about the lady who never slept. But whispers didn't carry beyond kitchen gossip, and Lucien never descended into servant quarters to hear what his staff actually thought about anything. Then Lady Seraphine Vale arrived in Blackthorn. She came as a guest of Lucien's cousin during the harvest season, 26 years old with golden hair that caught sunlight like expensive jewelry, a laugh that commanded attention across crowded rooms, and the kind of beauty that made men stupid. Lucien noticed her immediately. Not because she was extraordinary. Beautiful women had always been available to him, but because she noticed him with the focused intensity of someone who had already decided what she wanted. At a dinner party celebrating the autumn hunt, Seraphine positioned herself beside Lucien and spent the entire evening asking him about his military campaigns with breathless fascination. "Tell me about Thornridge," she said, leaning close enough that her perfume became distracting. "Everyone says you saw the solution before anyone else even understood the problem." Lucien felt something warm spread through his chest. The Solmeyer commanders were overconfident, he explained. They assumed winter would protect their advance. "I simply recognized that weather could become a weapon if positioned correctly." "Brilliant," Seraphine whispered. Across the table, Evelyn sat quietly cutting meat into precise pieces, her expression unreadable. Lucien didn't notice. Over the following weeks, Seraphine became a regular presence at Blackthorn Castle. She attended state dinners. She joined hunting parties. She appeared at court functions wearing gowns that looked like liquid silver, and always she gravitated toward Lucien. The attention was intoxicating, not because Lucien lacked female admirers. He'd always had access to mistresses, courtesans, women who threw themselves at power without hesitation. But Seraphine offered something different. She made him feel like the version of himself he believed he deserved to be. Brilliant, magnetic, indispensable. She asked his opinions on politics. She laughed at his observations about court intrigue. She touched his arm when making a point and let her fingers linger just slightly too long. One evening, after a particularly tedious council meeting, Lucien found her waiting in the corridor outside his study. "I was hoping you might show me your war chamber," she said. "Everyone talks about your maps and tactical displays, but I've never seen them." "It's late," Lucien replied, knowing exactly where this conversation was heading. "I don't mind late." He showed her the war chamber. They did not discuss maps for very long. Afterward, standing near the window while Seraphine adjusted her gown with practiced efficiency, Lucian felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not quite guilt, more like awareness. Evelyn would know. Servants always talked. Castle walls contained no real secrets. But when he returned to his chambers hours later, Evelyn was asleep. Or pretending to sleep. Her breathing was too controlled for genuine rest. He didn't ask. She didn't confront. And the silence between them hardened into something permanent. Seraphine became Lucien's constant companion after that night. She attended court functions at his side. She laughed at gatherings where Evelyn used to stand quietly. She occupied the spaces a wife should fill, but did so with dazzling visibility that made everyone notice. The noble houses watched with careful interest. Some approved. A duke deserved a woman who matched his stature. Others whispered behind fans and closed doors about propriety and tradition. None of them said anything directly to Lucian's face because men with his reputation didn't accept criticism about personal matters. And through it all, Evelyn continued her work. Military strategies still appeared on Lucian's desk. Intelligence assessments still arrived precisely when needed. The machinery of his success continued operating smoothly. He assumed this meant she had accepted the arrangement, that she understood how the world worked, that she recognized her role in maintaining his greatness. He was wrong about everything. The first crack appeared at the Winter Dominion Ball. The annual celebration took place in the royal palace with every significant noble house in attendance. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors. Musicians played beneath gold-painted arches. The kingdom's elite gathered to display wealth and negotiate power through carefully orchestrated social theater. Lucien arrived with Seraphine on his arm. She wore crimson silk that looked like liquid fire against her skin. Diamonds hung from her throat. Men turned to watch her pass. Evelyn arrived separately wearing silver gray that made her nearly invisible against the stone columns. For the first hour, Lucien danced with Seraphine. They moved across the ballroom floor with practiced elegance while conversations stopped to watch. Seraphine laughed brilliantly. Lucien smiled with the confidence of a man who believed the entire kingdom existed to appreciate him. Near the refreshment tables, several young noblewomen stood clustered together, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard. "The ghost wife," one of them said, glancing toward Evelyn. "That's what everyone calls her now." Another laughed softly. "Can you imagine being married to the most powerful duke in the kingdom and being that forgettable? At least she knows her place." A third added, "Some women understand they're meant to be decorative furniture rather than actual partners." The words carried across marble floors designed to amplify sound. Evelyn stood 10 feet away. Her expression didn't change. She set down her untouched glass of wine with careful precision, turned, and walked toward this corridor leading to the palace gardens. No one noticed her leave, except Seraphine. From across the ballroom, still dancing with Lucien, she watched Evelyn disappear and smiled with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has successfully claimed territory. Outside, rain had started falling. Evelyn stood beneath a stone archway overlooking the garden paths, watching water turn the courtyard into a dark mirror. She didn't cry. Crying implied surprise, and nothing about tonight surprised her anymore. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She made a decision. Inside the ballroom, Lucien finally noticed her absence an hour later. "Where's Evelyn?" he asked Seraphine between dances. She shrugged beautifully. "Does it matter?" And Lucien, surrounded by music and light, and the intoxicating certainty of his own importance, decided it didn't. 3 days later, everything changed. Lucien returned to Blackthorn Castle after meetings in the capital to find several letters waiting on his desk. Most were routine correspondence. One was marked urgent from General Hartwick regarding border tensions with Solmire. He opened it, expecting another situation requiring strategic analysis. Instead, he found a single sentence. "The Lady Evelyn requested copies of all cipher documentation last month. I assumed this was at your instruction. Please confirm." Lucien read the letter 3 times. Cold understanding spread through his chest like winter water. He walked directly to his private study, the room where he kept sensitive military documents in a hidden safe behind his father's portrait. The safe was locked. The combination worked. Inside, the main cipher ledger sat exactly where it should be. Lucien pulled it out, opened the leather cover, and felt reality shift underneath him. The pages were blank, not damaged, not torn, deliberately replaced with empty paper. His hands started shaking. He rifled through the rest of the safe's contents. Backup documentation. Military codes. Intelligence summaries. All replicas. all useless. On the inside cover of the fake ledger, written in Evelyn's elegant handwriting, were 4 words that would haunt him for years. You built nothing yourself. Lucian stood in his study surrounded by the empty symbols of borrowed power while outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the northern territories like an approaching army. And somewhere beyond the borders of his carefully constructed empire, his wife was already negotiating with his enemies using the only language that had ever really mattered, the one she had written. Lucian stood in his study for 3 hours after discovering the theft, staring at blank pages that should have contained the entire operational framework of Northern Military Command. His mind kept circling the same impossible fact. Evelyn had disappeared with the Blackthorn cipher. Not stolen documents, not gold, not jewels, the actual language that controlled armies. Outside his window, dawn broke cold and gray over the castle walls. Servants would be waking soon. The household would begin its daily rituals. Everyone would move through their routines, pretending the world hadn't fundamentally shifted overnight. But Lucian knew the truth now. Every victory he'd celebrated, every tactical innovation the kingdom had praised, every moment of brilliance that had built his legend, none of it had actually been his. The realization didn't arrive as dramatic revelation. It came as slow-spreading numbness, like frostbite working through flesh one layer at a time. He'd spent a decade believing in his own exceptionalism, while his wife quietly assembled and operated the machinery that made exceptionalism possible. And now she'd taken that machinery with her. Lucian finally moved at sunrise. He walked to his desk and pulled out fresh paper. His hand shook slightly as he tried to write a simple coded message to General Hartwick, using the cipher protocols he should have memorized years ago. The symbols looked familiar. He knew he'd seen them thousands of times, but translating them into actual military instruction felt like trying to read a language he'd only ever heard spoken, never learned to write himself. After 20 minutes, he gave up. The message was incomprehensible garbage. He crumpled the paper and threw it into the fireplace, watching it burn. Then he did what powerful men always do when reality stops cooperating. He got angry. Lucian summoned his personal guard captain before breakfast. The man arrived quickly, still fastening his sword belt, clearly sensing urgency. "Find Lady Evelyn," Lucian said. "She left the Winter Dominion Ball 3 nights ago and hasn't returned to the castle. Check the eastern roads first. She has family in the provinces." The captain hesitated. "My lord, if the lady has chosen to travel, perhaps she simply needs—" "She didn't choose anything," Lucian interrupted. "She's confused, possibly unwell. I want her found and brought home immediately. Use discretion, but use speed." The captain bowed and left. Lucian stood alone in his study, trying to convince himself this was a temporary problem, that Evelyn was hiding somewhere dramatic, waiting for him to apologize, that she'd return once she realized life outside Blackthorn Castle was harder than wounded pride, that the cipher didn't actually matter because surely he could figure it out himself given enough time. Every assumption was wrong, but men like Lucian had spent their entire lives being right, and breaking that pattern required admitting a kind of failure that felt worse than death. 2 days passed. The guard captain returned with nothing. No trace of Lady Evelyn on the eastern roads. No one at her family estate had seen her. The few servants who remembered her departure from the ball recalled only that she'd walked toward the gardens during a rainstorm and never came back inside. She'd vanished like smoke. Meanwhile, the first cracks in Lucian's military command started showing. A routine supply shipment to the northern border forts went to the wrong location because the logistics coordinator couldn't read the updated cipher instructions. 300 soldiers spent 4 days without proper provisions before someone figured out the mistake. A scheduled troop rotation got delayed because the movement orders contained symbols that had somehow changed meaning, and nobody could verify the correct interpretation. Border Patrol reports came back labeled urgent, but sat unread on Lucian's desk because he couldn't decode them fast enough to respond appropriately. Small problems, fixable problems, except they kept multiplying. Lucian tried to maintain appearances. He attended council meetings. He nodded seriously when generals presented intelligence assessments he only half understood. He signed documents authorizing military actions he couldn't actually evaluate, and every night he returned to his study and stared at cipher ledgers that might as well have been written in a dead language. The thing about borrowed brilliance is that it only works when nobody questions the source. The moment people start wondering why the machinery stopped functioning, they begin looking for explanations. And those explanations eventually point backward toward uncomfortable truths. General Hartwick was the first to ask the question directly. He arrived at Blackthorn Castle 2 weeks after Evelyn's disappearance. ostensibly for a routine strategic briefing, but actually because the rumors spreading through military command had finally reached critical mass. They met in Lucian's war chamber, surrounded by maps marking territories that felt increasingly theoretical. Hartwick was 63 years old, gray-haired and blunt in the way of men who'd survived 4 decades of military politics by saying difficult things other people avoided. He got straight to the point. "Where's Lady Evelyn?" "Traveling," Lucian said. "Visiting family. For 2 weeks. She needed time away from court." Hartwick studied him with the careful attention of someone reading an enemy's defensive positions. "The cipher protocols have changed 17 times in the last decade," he said slowly. Each change was subtle but sophisticated. Required intimate knowledge of northern military operations, enemy intelligence patterns, seasonal logistics. Your father could do it because he spent 40 years building the system, but these modifications happened after his death. "Your point, General." Hartwick leaned forward. "My point is that genius doesn't appear suddenly in a man at age 31. It develops over time through study and experience. You've been brilliant since the moment you took power, brilliant in ways your father never was. And now, 2 weeks after your wife disappears, we're getting cipher instructions that don't make sense and supply chains that are collapsing." Lucian felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're suggesting what exactly?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the Lady Evelyn wasn't just managing your household." The silence stretched between them like a blade. Lucian could have responded with outrage, could have thrown Hartwick out, could have used his authority to crush the question before it spread. Instead, he made a choice that revealed exactly how desperate he'd become. He told the truth, not all of it, not the humiliating details about his complete dependence, but enough. "Evelyn helped with certain administrative aspects of military planning," he admitted carefully. "She had a talent for organization and detail work." Hartwick's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Detail work." "Yes." The general stood up slowly. "I've served 3 generations of Mordain dukes," he said quietly. "Your grandfather. Your father. You. I watched your father build that cipher system over decades. I watched him struggle with every modification. I watched him age 20 years trying to keep it functional under pressure." He walked to the window overlooking the training yards below. "Your wife, who everyone called the ghost of Blackthorn because she was so quiet and forgettable, somehow mastered in a few years what took your father a lifetime to create. And you're telling me she handled detail work?" Lucian said nothing. Hartwick turned back to face him. "Here's what's going to happen. Enemy intelligence will notice our operational confusion within weeks if they haven't already. The noble houses will start questioning your tactical competence. The king will want explanations for why Northern Command is suddenly unreliable. And none of those people are going to accept that your wife left and took your brain with her." "What do you recommend?" Lucian asked. "Find her. Bring her back. Fix this before it becomes permanent. And if she doesn't want to come back..." Hartwick's expression hardened into something that looked like disappointment. "Then you'd better learn to be the genius everyone thinks you are. Fast." He left without being dismissed. Lucian stood alone in his war chamber, surrounded by the maps and battle plans and territorial markers of an empire that suddenly felt like borrowed clothes that no longer fit. The thing about power is that it doesn't care about fairness or justice or who actually deserves it. Power only cares about function. And when the machinery stops working, power moves to whoever can make it work again. That night, Lucian made a decision that would haunt him forever. He sent for Lady Seraphine. She arrived at midnight wearing silk that whispered against stone floors, her hair loose around her shoulders, clearly expecting romance or attention or whatever it was she thought their relationship provided. Instead, Lucian handed her a glass of wine and sat across from her in his study, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. "I need your help," he said. Seraphine smiled. She loved being needed. Anything. Evelyn took something when she left. Something important. I need it back, and I need people to believe nothing is wrong until she returns. Seraphine's smile faded slightly. What did she take? Military documentation, intelligence materials, things she shouldn't have had access to. This was mostly true. Close enough to reality to be believable, without revealing the full scope of his humiliation. Seraphine leaned forward, her expression sharpening. You want me to help find her? No. I want you to help me maintain appearances. Attend court functions at my side, reinforce my reputation. Make sure the noble houses see strength and stability. He didn't say the other part. that he needed her to be the visible, decorative partner who could occupy attention while he frantically tried to learn military strategy that should have been instinctive years ago. That he needed a distraction beautiful enough to make people stop asking questions. Seraphine studied him carefully. She wasn't stupid. Ambitious women rarely were. She understood exactly what he was offering and what he was hiding. And in that moment, she made her own calculation about power and proximity and what happened to people who tied themselves to sinking ships. But she smiled anyway. "Of course," she said, "whatever you need." They sealed the arrangement that night in ways that had nothing to do with strategy. And somewhere beyond the northern borders, in the marble halls of the Solmeyer Empire, Evelyn was negotiating her own arrangements with people who actually valued competence. The meeting took place in Empress Celine Veyer's private study 3 weeks after Evelyn crossed the border. The room was smaller than expected. Dark wood panels, tall windows overlooking the imperial capital, books stacked on every surface in careful disorder that suggested actual use rather than decoration. The Empress herself was 58 years old, with silver hair cut shorter than fashion dictated, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She sat behind a desk covered in military correspondence and studied Evelyn with the focused attention of someone evaluating an unexpected weapon. Between them sat the Blackthorn cipher. Evelyn had placed it there when she first requested this audience, hadn't explained its significance, hadn't begged for protection or asylum. She'd simply presented it as leverage and waited to see if the Empress was intelligent enough to recognize what leverage actually meant. Celine had picked up the ledger, spent 40 minutes reading, then looked up with an expression that could have been approval or hunger, or both. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "It's functional," Evelyn replied. "It's more than functional. This is the entire operational framework of Northern Command. Supply chains, troop movements, defensive protocols, communication systems, everything." Evelyn said nothing. The Empress closed the ledger carefully. "Your husband is Duke Lucien Mordain, the man every military academy studies, the tactical genius who stopped our advance at Thornridge Pass." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "My husband is a man who looks impressive in formal settings and speaks confidently about battles other people plan for him." Celine smiled. It was not a warm smile. "How long?" 5 years, Evelyn said. "Since Thornridge?" The Empress leaned back in her chair. "You know what this means? If you're lying, if this is some elaborate deception to feed us false intelligence, we'll execute you in ways that make examples last for generations." "I'm not lying," Evelyn said simply. Celine studied her for a long moment. "Why now? Why not 2 years ago or 4 years ago or next year? Why leave now?" Evelyn thought about the Winter Dominion Ball, the whispered insults, the casual cruelty. Seraphine's smile, Lucien's complete indifference. She thought about 5 years of invisible work and stolen credit and slow suffocation. She thought about the divorce papers being drawn up and the asylum waiting to erase her permanently. But she didn't say any of that, because powerful women understood that survival wasn't about feelings, it was about leverage. "He planned to have me committed," Evelyn said, "locked away permanently so I couldn't talk about what I knew. I left before he could finish the arrangements." "Smart," Celine said. "Necessary." The Empress stood and walked to the window. "I'm not a sentimental woman, Lady Evelyn. I don't offer protection out of kindness. I don't rescue people because their husbands are cruel. Half the noble houses in my own empire treat their wives like furniture, and I don't invade their territories over marital problems." "I'm not asking you to rescue me," Evelyn said. "I'm offering you military intelligence worth more than 3 campaigns. The question is whether you're smart enough to use it." Celine turned back to face her. For the first time since entering the room, she smiled like she meant it. "What do you want in return?" Evelyn had spent 3 weeks thinking about this answer, rehearsing it, examining it from every angle to make sure it contained no weakness that could be exploited later. Citizenship. Status. A position in your intelligence council. Not as someone's wife, not as a dependent, as a permanent member with actual authority. And if I refuse, then I take the cipher to the Westmarch Kingdoms or the Southern Coalitions or whoever else wants to know how Northern Military Command actually operates. Someone will pay for this information. You're simply the closest option. Celine studied her with something that looked like genuine respect. "You're much more interesting than your reputation suggested," she said. "My reputation was designed that way," Evelyn replied. "Invisible women hear everything." The Empress walked back to her desk and sat down. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll work with our intelligence directorate for 3 months. Prove the cipher is legitimate. Prove you can translate it reliably. Prove you're not a blackthorn plant sent to poison our military planning. If you pass those tests, you'll get everything you asked for. And if I fail, then you'll have other problems. Evelyn stood. When do I start? Tomorrow, Celine said. I'm sending reconnaissance units toward the northern border in 2 weeks. If your intelligence is accurate, we should be able to position forces in ways that exploit every weakness in Blackthorn's defensive structure. She paused. And if your husband truly is as dependent on your work as you claim, then 2 weeks from now, his entire command system should start collapsing in real time. Evelyn felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. It will, she said quietly. Good, the Empress replied, because I'm about to teach your husband what happens when men mistake borrowed power for actual competence. The door opened behind Evelyn. A military aide waited to escort her to whatever temporary quarters they'd arranged. Before leaving, Evelyn turned back one last time. One question, she said. Celine looked up from the papers she'd already returned to reading. Why? Evelyn asked. Why trust me at all? I'm an enemy duke's wife showing up with stolen intelligence. Every logical assessment says this is a trap. The Empress set down her pen. Because, she said carefully, powerful men make the same mistake repeatedly throughout history. They confuse visibility with competence. They assume the person speaking loudest in the room is the person doing the actual thinking, and they completely overlook the quiet ones who make everything function. She gestured at the cipher ledger. Your husband is everything wrong with hereditary power. Entitled, lazy, convinced his birthright makes him special. Men like that don't suddenly develop tactical genius in their 30s. Someone creates it for them. Usually someone they underestimate completely. Evelyn said nothing. I'm trusting you, Celine continued, because you're exactly the kind of asset men like your husband always throw away. And I built my empire by collecting the things other rulers are too stupid to value. She smiled. Now get out. You have work to do. Evelyn left. Behind her, the Empress returned to her correspondence, already planning the campaign that would break Blackthorn's power forever. And in the Northern Territories, Lucien attended another court function with Seraphine on his arm, smiling confidently while his empire crumbled beneath foundations he'd never actually built himself. The reconnaissance reports arrived at Blackthorn Castle on a cold morning 6 weeks after Evelyn's disappearance. Solmeyer forces had been spotted moving along the eastern borders in unusual formations. Not an invasion, not yet, but positioning, testing, probing for weaknesses in defensive structures that should have been impenetrable. Lucien read the reports 3 times, trying to decode the tactical implications. Under normal circumstances, he would have understood immediately what the enemy was attempting. Under normal circumstances, Evelyn would have already drafted the counter-strategy before he even saw the initial intelligence. But circumstances were no longer normal. He called an emergency military council that afternoon. 7 generals and 4 senior strategists gathered in the war chamber, all of them watching Lucien with expressions that ranged from concern to barely concealed doubt. General Hartwick sat at the far end of the table, silent. Lucien presented the reconnaissance reports and asked for strategic assessments. The discussion that followed was disaster. Every general had a different opinion. Every strategist contradicted someone else's analysis. The debate circled itself repeatedly without reaching any coherent conclusion. And Lucien, who should have been able to cut through the confusion with clear tactical direction, found himself drowning in information he couldn't quite organize into understanding. He heard himself speaking with the confident authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but the words felt hollow, like reciting lines from a play he'd never actually rehearsed. After 2 hours, they settled on a defensive strategy that everyone seemed lukewarm about, but nobody could definitively oppose. Lucien signed the deployment orders and dismissed the council. As everyone filed out, Hartwick remained behind. That was embarrassing, the old general said flatly. Lucien felt anger spike hot in his chest. We reached a consensus. We reached confusion, Hartwick corrected. Half those generals left this room thinking you've lost your tactical instincts. The other half are starting to wonder if you ever had them in the first place. Careful, General. No, Hartwick said. You be careful. Because in 3 months, maybe 6 if we're lucky, everyone in this kingdom is going to realize that the legendary Duke Mordain was only legendary because his forgotten wife was doing all the thinking. Lucien stood up fast enough that his chair scraped backward. Get out! Hartwick didn't move. Find her, he said again. Whatever it costs, whatever you have to promise, find her and fix this before there's nothing left to fix." Then he left. Lucien stood alone in his war chamber, surrounded by maps and documents and the crushing weight of inadequacy he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the northern mountains. And far beyond those mountains, in the imperial capital of Solmire, Evelyn was teaching enemy commanders exactly where to strike to make an empire bleed. The attack came 4 weeks later. Not a full invasion, something worse. Surgical strikes against supply depots, coordinated raids on communication outposts, small forces hitting defensive weak points with impossible precision, every target chosen to maximize disruption while minimizing direct confrontation. Every strike designed to demonstrate knowledge of Blackthorn's military infrastructure that should have been secret. The Northern Territories started hemorrhaging resources and control faster than anyone could contain, and Lucien finally understood what genuine helplessness felt like. He could see the pattern, could recognize that someone with intimate knowledge of his defensive systems was guiding enemy forces. But he couldn't stop it, because stopping it required the same expertise that had built those systems in the first place. Expertise he'd never actually possessed. The thing about borrowed power is that eventually someone asks for the loan back. And when that happens, you discover exactly how much of yourself was real and how much was just convenient fiction maintained through other people's invisible work. Lucien Mordain had spent a decade believing in his own greatness. Now he was learning the truth about what happens when the machinery underneath greatness stops functioning. He was learning that reputation built on stolen brilliance collapses faster than reputation built on genuine failure. He was learning that the most ruthless thing a person can do isn't cruelty. It's leaving. Just walking away and letting everything you quietly held together finally collapse under its own weight. 3 months after Evelyn disappeared into the storm, a message arrived at Blackthorn Castle under Imperial seal. Lucien opened it alone in his study. Inside was a single page written in handwriting he recognized immediately. The letter contained no greeting, no signature, just 3 sentences. You have 2 choices. Surrender Northern Command to Solmire Oversight and retain your title as ceremonial figurehead. Or refuse and watch everything you claim to build burn completely. At the bottom of the page, written in the Blackthorn cipher he could no longer read, was a final sentence. He stared at the symbols, trying desperately to decode them. But they might as well have been written in a language that had never existed. Lucien sat in his study as the sun set over territories that were no longer truly his, holding a message from the wife he'd dismissed as furniture, finally understanding that the empire had never belonged to him at all. It had belonged to the woman he'd never bothered to see. And now she was taking it back, one calculated strike at a time. Lucien stared at the coded message until the words blurred into meaningless symbols, exactly like every other piece of cipher documentation that had mocked him for 3 months. Surrender or burn. Those were his options now, reduced to binary choices by a woman he'd dismissed as decorative furniture for 5 years. He set the letter down carefully, as if sudden movement might somehow make the situation worse, and walked to the window overlooking the northern training yards, where soldiers drilled in formations that no longer meant what they used to mean. Everything looked the same. The castle walls still stood. The banners still flew. The servants still bowed when he passed. But underneath the surface, the entire structure was collapsing like a building with termites in the foundation. You couldn't see the damage until you put weight on something and it crumbled beneath you. Lucien had been putting weight on borrowed competence for a decade. Now the floor was giving way. He turned back to his desk and did something he hadn't done since he was a child learning to write. He tried to compose a response, not using the cipher. He'd given up pretending he could decode military communications weeks ago. Just a simple letter, direct, personal. Attempting to reach the woman who'd apparently been studying him for 5 years while he never bothered to learn anything about her except that she stayed quiet and didn't cause problems. The words came slowly. Evelyn, I received your message. I understand you're angry. You have reasons. But destroying everything we built together accomplishes nothing except chaos. He stopped. Read it again. The lie sat there on the page like spoiled meat. Everything we built together. They hadn't built anything together. She'd built it. He'd taken credit. That was the actual arrangement. Pretending otherwise now wouldn't convince anyone, especially not the woman who'd lived through 5 years of systematic erasure. Lucien crumpled the paper and started again. This time, he tried honesty. Evelyn, I was wrong. About everything. I didn't see your contributions, didn't value your work, didn't treat you with the respect you deserved. I'm asking you to come home. Not because I deserve it, because we can fix this. He read it 3 times. It sounded desperate because it was desperate. But desperation was all he had left. He sealed the letter and called for a courier, someone fast and discreet who could reach the Solmire border within 2 days. Then he waited. The response arrived 6 days later. Not from Evelyn, from Empress Celine Vere herself. The letter was brief and contained no diplomatic niceties. Duke Mordain. Lady Evelyn has no interest in your apologies or your proposals for reconciliation. Her status within Solmire is permanent and protected. Any attempts to retrieve her by force will be considered acts of war. You have 3 weeks to accept our terms or face full military action against the Northern Territories. Choose wisely. Lucien read the letter twice, feeling something cold and final settle into his bones. She wasn't coming back. Not because she was being held against her will, because she'd found something better. The thing about people who've been invisible their entire lives is that when someone finally sees them, when someone finally values what they can do, loyalty shifts faster than ice melting in summer. Evelyn had spent 5 years being ignored in Blackthorn Castle. 3 months being valued in Solmire had probably felt like oxygen after drowning. Why would she ever return to suffocation? That night, Lucien did something he should have done months earlier. He called a private meeting with General Hartwick and told him everything. Not the sanitized version. Not the face-saving fiction about administrative support and detail work. The truth. They met in Lucien's study after midnight. No servants, no witnesses. Just 2 men and the wreckage of an empire built on borrowed brilliance. Hartwick listened without interrupting while Lucien explained how Thornridge had actually been won, how every strategy for the past 5 years had actually been developed, how completely dependent he'd become on competence he never acknowledged. When Lucien finished, the old general sat silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. How much of your reputation is real? Lucien felt the question like a blade between his ribs. I'm good at combat, he said. Direct confrontation. Tactical improvisation in the moment. Everything my father taught me before he died. And strategy. Long-term planning. Intelligence analysis. Lucien said nothing. Hartwick's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes looked like disgust. So you're basically an expensive sword, he said flatly. Good at hitting things. Useless at thinking 3 moves ahead. That's reductive. It's accurate, Hartwick said. Your father spent 40 years building the Blackthorn military system because he understood that real power isn't about winning battles. It's about controlling the infrastructure that makes battles winnable. You inherited the infrastructure and assumed you'd inherited the intelligence too. I made mistakes, Lucien admitted. You made one mistake, Hartwick corrected. You confused proximity to brilliance with actual brilliance, and now you're paying for it. The general stood up and walked to the window. Here's what's going to happen. Solmire will take the Northern Territories piece by piece over the next year. They'll use your wife's intelligence to dismantle everything your family built for 3 generations. The noble houses will abandon you. The king will strip your titles. And history will remember Duke Lucien Mordain as the man who destroyed his own empire through arrogance and stupidity. Unless, Lucien said. Hartwick turned back. Unless what? You think there's a solution here. Some tactical brilliance you've been hiding that will magically fix this. Lucien met his eyes. What if I could get her back? The general laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. She doesn't want to come back. Did you not understand the Empress's letter? Your wife found people who actually value her. She's not going to abandon that because you suddenly realized you need her. What if I could offer her something better than what Solmire provides? Hartwick stared at him. What could you possibly offer that's better than status, protection, and genuine respect from people who aren't you? Lucien took a breath. Everything, he said. Complete authority over Northern Military Command, public recognition, her name on every treaty and strategy document, full partnership instead of invisible support. You're describing a fantasy, Hartwick said. The noble houses would never accept a woman in actual military command. The king would never approve it. You'd be destroyed politically within weeks. I'm being destroyed already, Lucien said. At least this way I deserve it. The general studied him for a long moment. You're serious? I'm desperate, Lucien replied. There's a difference. Hartwick walked back to the table and sat down heavily. Even if you could offer that, even if the kingdom somehow accepted it, why would she believe you? You spent 5 years treating her like furniture. Now you're promising her a throne. That sounds like a trap. Then I'll put it in writing, Lucien said. Legal contracts, witnessed by the king himself. Irrevocable authority. Hartwick shook his head slowly. You still don't understand. This isn't about legal documents. It's about trust. You destroyed that completely. You don't rebuild trust with contracts. You rebuild it with time and consistency and changed behavior, none of which you can offer because you don't have time. So what do you recommend? Lucien asked. The general was quiet for a moment. Accept Solmeyer's terms, he said finally. Surrender military command. Retain your title as ceremonial figurehead. Live quietly. Maybe in 20 years, people will forget what a disaster you were. That's not acceptable. It's the only realistic option. Lucien stood up. I'm not surrendering, he said. Then you're a fool, Hartwick replied. But you've always been a fool. You just had a smart wife hiding it. He left without being dismissed. Lucien stood alone in his study, surrounded by the quiet wreckage of everything he thought he'd built, and made a decision that would prove Hartwick right about foolishness. He decided to go to Solmeyer himself, not with an army, not with threats, as a negotiator. One last attempt to speak directly to the woman he'd failed to see for 5 years and somehow convince her that this time would be different. It was a terrible plan, desperate and foolish and almost certainly doomed to fail. But it was the only plan he had left. The journey to Solmeyer took 8 days. Lucien traveled with minimal escort, 4 guards, 1 diplomatic courier, no banners or ceremonial displays. Just a duke who looked increasingly less like a duke with every mile that passed. They crossed the border at dawn on the 9th day. Solmeyer border guards stopped them immediately. Professional, efficient, unsurprised. They'd been expecting him. One of the guards handed Lucien a sealed message. He opened it standing in the middle of the road while morning light turned the eastern sky purple. The message was from Evelyn, Duke Mordain. I know why you've come. The answer is no. Return to Blackthorn. Accept the Empress's terms. Move forward with whatever life remains to you. This conversation is finished. Lucien read it twice. Then he looked at the border guard. I need to see her anyway, he said. The guard's expression suggested this was expected too. The Empress anticipated you would ignore Lady Evelyn's request, he said. You'll be escorted to the capital under supervision. Any attempt to deviate from the approved route will be considered hostile action. Understood, Lucien said. They rode for 3 more days. The Solmeyer countryside looked prosperous in ways the northern territories didn't anymore. Clean roads, well-maintained farms, villages that seemed functional rather than barely surviving. Lucien noticed these things with the attention of a man who was finally learning to actually look at the world around him instead of just assuming it existed to admire him. Too late. Much too late, but noticing anyway. They reached the imperial capital on the 12th day. The city was larger than Lucien expected. Marble buildings, wide streets, gardens integrated into urban planning with genuine thought rather than decorative afterthought. Everything about it suggested competent governance over generations, the kind of infrastructure that required intelligence to maintain. His escort delivered him to a government building near the palace. Not a prison. Not quite. But definitely not guest quarters. A holding room with windows and comfortable furniture and guards outside the door. He waited for 6 hours. Finally, the door opened. But the person who entered wasn't Evelyn. It was Empress Selene Vere herself. She was smaller than Lucien expected and older and carried herself with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent 40 years making decisions that affected millions of lives. She studied him with the same careful attention he'd seen in General Hartwick's eyes. The look of someone evaluating a broken tool and deciding whether it was worth repairing. Duke Mordain, she said. You're either very brave or very stupid. I haven't decided which. Lucien stood. I came to speak with my wife. Your wife has no interest in speaking with you. I told you this in my letter. She told you this in her message. Yet, here you are. Selene walked to the window overlooking the city. Do you know what I find fascinating about men like you? You spend your entire lives assuming the world operates according to your preferences. When reality contradicts those preferences, you simply ignore reality and keep pushing forward as if determination alone can reshape truth. I'm asking for one conversation, Lucien said. You're asking for absolution, the Empress corrected. You're hoping that if you can just explain yourself convincingly enough, if you can demonstrate sufficient contrition, your wife will forgive you and return to being the invisible machinery that made you look competent. That's not... Don't lie, Selene interrupted. Not to me, possibly not even to yourself anymore. You had 5 years to see Lady Evelyn's value. You chose not to. Now she's valuable to me instead. That's not a tragedy. That's consequences. Lucien felt something hot and desperate rise in his chest. You're using her, he said, just like I did. The only difference is you're honest about it. The Empress turned to face him. The difference, she said coldly, is that I pay her in status and respect and genuine authority. You paid her in humiliation and invisibility. Don't confuse your exploitation with my recognition. She walked toward the door. Lady Evelyn works in the Intelligence Directorate now. Her analysis has already prevented 2 border conflicts and restructured our entire Eastern defensive strategy. She attends council meetings. Her name appears on official documentation. People know who she is and what she's capable of. Celine paused at the door. Can you offer her anything remotely comparable? Yes, Lucian said. The Empress raised one eyebrow. Then you're delusional, she said, because everything you have left to offer was built on work she did for you. Returning to Blackthorn would be returning to the scene of her own erasure. Why would she choose that? Because I'll be different, Lucian said. Men like you are never different, Celine replied. You're just temporarily inconvenienced. She left. Lucian stood alone in the holding room, feeling the last fragments of hope crack and dissolve. He'd traveled 12 days to hear what he already knew, that some betrayals can't be fixed through negotiation, that some damage is permanent, that the woman he'd treated like furniture had finally realized she was made of stronger material than the empire he'd built on top of her. 2 hours later, the door opened again. This time it was Eveline. She stood in the doorway wearing deep blue instead of the gray he remembered. Her hair pulled back but less severely, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lucien had spent 12 days planning what he would say, how he would apologize, what promises he could make that might convince her to reconsider. But standing there looking at her, actually seeing her properly for maybe the first time in 5 years, every prepared speech evaporated because he finally understood what General Hartwick had tried to tell him weeks ago. This wasn't about words. It was about a fundamental imbalance that couldn't be fixed through apologies or promises or legal contracts guaranteeing authority. He'd spent 5 years taking everything from her. She'd spent 3 months discovering she didn't need him at all. Those weren't negotiable positions. They were just facts. You shouldn't have come, Evelyn said quietly. I had to try, Lucian replied. Why? Because I was wrong. About everything. Eveline walked into the room slowly, like someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. She sat down across from him. Do you know what the worst part was? She said. It wasn't the invisibility. It wasn't even the lack of credit. It was watching you accept praise for work you didn't do and never questioning where it came from. Lucian said nothing. 5 years, Evelyn continued. 5 years of solving problems you couldn't solve. 5 years of making you look brilliant, and you never once asked how it happened. You just assumed you deserved it. I know, Lucian said. No, Evelyn said. You don't know. You can't know. Because you've never been erased. You've never had someone take your work and present it as their own while you stood there watching and couldn't say anything because speaking up would destroy the only stability you had. She leaned forward. Do you know what I thought about every time you walked into a council meeting and presented one of my strategies as your own? Lucian shook his head. I thought about how easy it would be to stop, she said. To just let you fail. To watch everything collapse and finally prove to everyone that the legendary Duke Mordain was only legendary because his invisible wife was doing all the thinking. Why didn't you? Lucien asked. Evelyn smiled. It was not a warm smile. Because I was terrified, she said. Terrified of what would happen if I stopped being useful. Terrified of being cast aside. Terrified of ending up in an asylum or dead or simply erased from history completely. She stood up. But then I realized something. The thing I was terrified of was already happening. I was already erased, already invisible, already treated like nothing. Evelyn walked to the window. So I took the one thing you actually needed, and I left. And you know what I discovered? That the world is full of people who actually value competence, who don't need to steal credit to feel important, who treat intelligence like an asset instead of a threat. She turned back to face him. You came here thinking you could negotiate, thinking you could offer me something valuable enough to make me return. But you don't have anything I need anymore. And that's the part you still don't understand. Lucien felt something break inside his chest, not his pride. That had shattered weeks ago, something deeper. The fundamental belief that he mattered, that his existence created value, that people needed him for anything beyond the power he'd borrowed from someone else. I'm sorry, he said. The words felt inadequate the moment they left his mouth. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. I know you are, she said quietly. But sorry doesn't rebuild 5 years of systematic erasure. Sorry doesn't return the credit you stole. Sorry doesn't make me trust you again. She walked toward the door. Go home, Lucien. Accept Celine's terms. Learn to be whatever you actually are without me holding you up. Maybe in 10 years you'll be someone worth respecting. What if I can't? Lucian asked. Eveline paused at the door. Then you'll fail, she said, and everyone will see what I saw all along, that you were never actually brilliant, you were just standing in brilliant lighting. She left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Lucien sat in the empty room, surrounded by marble walls that belonged to an empire he'd tried to destroy and failed to destroy because destroying it required the same competence that had kept his own empire functioning. Competence he'd never possessed. He thought about General Hartwick's advice, about surrendering, about accepting ceremonial irrelevance, about living quietly while history forgot him. He thought about Seraphine waiting in Blackthorn Castle, probably already calculating her exit strategy now that his usefulness had expired. He thought about walking back through those castle doors and facing the servants who'd watched him fail, the generals who'd lost faith, the noble houses who'd stopped returning his correspondence. He thought about trying to rebuild something from the wreckage of borrowed brilliance, and for the first time in his entire life, Duke Lucien Mordain understood what it felt like to be completely powerless. Not the temporary powerlessness of a setback or a lost battle, the permanent powerlessness of discovering you were never actually the person you thought you were. That everything you believed about yourself was just reflection and echo and stolen light. That the empire was never yours. It was always hers. And now she'd taken it back. Guards escorted him out of Solmire the next morning. The journey back to Blackthorn took 9 days. Lucien spent most of it silent, watching northern territories that looked different now. Smaller somehow, less significant. Like seeing a childhood home after decades away and realizing it was never as grand as memory suggested. They reached Blackthorn Castle on a gray afternoon that smelled like rain. The castle staff assembled to receive him with appropriate formality. Their eyes held questions they were too professional to ask. Seraphine waited at the great hall wearing emerald silk that probably cost more than a soldier's annual wages. She smiled when she saw him. "Welcome home," she said. "We have so much to discuss." Lucien looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw ambition wearing beautiful packaging, saw calculation behind every smile, saw someone who'd attached herself to power without caring whether the power was real or borrowed. And he understood with sudden clarity that she would be gone within a month, as soon as better opportunities presented themselves, as soon as his usefulness expired completely. That was fine. He was finally learning to see people for what they actually were instead of what he wanted them to be. Progress. Too late. But progress. That night, alone in his study, Lucien opened the desk drawer where he'd kept Eveline's letter. The coded final sentence still sat there, mocking him with symbols he couldn't translate. He stared at it for an hour. Then he did something he should have done 5 years ago. He started learning, not because he thought mastering the cipher would bring Eveline back. She was gone. That door had closed permanently, but because if he was going to fail, if he was going to watch everything collapse, he wanted to fail as someone who'd at least tried to become the person he'd pretended to be, someone who earned their reputation instead of stealing it, someone who built empires instead of borrowing them. It was too late to save Blackthorn, too late to save his marriage, too late to save the legend of Duke Lucien Mordain, but maybe it wasn't too late to become someone real, someone actual, someone who finally understood that power without competence is just expensive decoration waiting to shatter. Outside his window, storm clouds gathered over the northern mountains. And in the Solmire capital, Eveline attended her first official council meeting as Senior Intelligence Director, her name written permanently into history instead of erased from it. The empire she'd built in secret was finally hers openly, and the man who'd stolen her brilliance sat alone in a crumbling castle, finally learning what she'd known all along. That borrowed light eventually runs out, and when it does, you discover exactly how much darkness you've been standing in. 6 months after Lucien returned from Solmire, the first real test arrived in the form of an autumn storm and 3,000 enemy soldiers positioned along the eastern border. Not a raid this time, an actual invasion force. Solmire had been patient, strategic, spending half a year bleeding the northern territories through surgical strikes and economic pressure, while Lucien struggled to learn military strategy that should have been instinctive years ago. Now patience had expired. The message arrived at dawn carried by a rider who'd killed 3 horses getting there fast enough. General Hartwick brought it directly to Lucien's study, where he'd spent another sleepless night surrounded by cipher texts and military theory books that read like a foreign language. "They're moving," Hartwick said without preamble. "Full battalion strength, siege equipment, supply trains for extended campaign." This isn't a probe anymore. They're coming to take everything. Lucien looked up from the desk covered in papers that represented 6 months of desperate education. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands shook slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. He'd aged a decade in half a year. Learning competence from scratch while your empire collapsed around you did that to a man. How long? He asked. 3 days, Hartwick said. Maybe 4 if the weather slows them. Lucien stood up and walked to the map table where the northern territories were marked in careful detail. Every fortress, every supply route, every defensive position that Eveline had once managed with invisible efficiency. He'd spent 6 months studying this map, learning it, understanding how the pieces actually connected instead of just assuming they worked through magic or destiny or whatever convenient fiction he'd believed before. He still wasn't good at strategy. Not the way Eveline had been. Not the way his father had been. But he was better than he used to be. Better than nothing. That would have to be enough. Show me their approach vector, he said. Hartwick moved to the map and traced the enemy advance with one weathered finger. Eastern passed through Thornridge. They'll use the same route we defended 5 years ago. Your wife knows every weakness in that position because she's the one who designed our defenses. Don't call her that, Lucien said quietly. Hartwick looked up. She's still legally your wife. Not in any way that matters. The general studied him for a moment, then returned to the map. They'll hit us at the narrow point here, force us to commit defenders in concentrated positions. Then flanking units will move through the forest approaches we thought were impassable. How do you know that's their plan? Because it's what I would do if I knew our defensive structure that intimately, Hartwick said. And she does. She built it. Lucy stared at the map, trying to think 3 moves ahead the way Eveline always had, trying to see patterns instead of just terrain. 6 months of study hadn't made him a genius, but it had taught him something more valuable. How to recognize his own limitations and work within them instead of pretending they didn't exist. We can't defend Thornridge, he said finally. Hartwick's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. If we abandon Thornridge, we lose the entire eastern approach. Solmeyer forces will pour through unopposed. I know, Lucien said. Then what are you suggesting? Lucien traced a different line on the map with his finger, moving westward toward terrain that looked defensible but wasn't strategically important. We pull back to Ravenscar. Consolidate forces. Make them overextend their supply lines, pursuing us into territory we actually understand. That's retreat, Hartwick said flatly. That's survival, Lucien corrected. We can't win a direct confrontation. She knows our defenses better than we do. So we changed the battlefield to somewhere she hasn't mapped. The general was quiet for a long moment. Your father never retreated, he said. My father also died at 58 with half the kingdom plotting against him, Lucien replied. Maybe retreat isn't the worst strategy. Hartwick almost smiled. You're learning, he said. Too slowly, Lucien said. But learning. They spent the next hour planning the withdrawal. It was ugly work. Retreat always was. Abandoning fortifications, evacuating civilian populations, accepting losses that felt like failure even when they were necessary. But necessary and comfortable rarely occupied the same space. Around noon, a servant interrupted with news that made everything more complicated. Lady Seraphine had left during the night, took her jewelry, took whatever gold she could carry, took the fastest horses from the stable, gone before the invasion news even arrived. Lucien listened to the report without visible reaction. He'd known she would leave eventually, had watched her calculating exit strategies for weeks as his reputation deteriorated and his usefulness expired. Ambitious people didn't sink with failing ships. They found better vessels. That was fine. He had larger problems than the departure of a woman who'd never been more than beautiful decoration anyway. The withdrawal began that afternoon. It was chaos wrapped in military precision. Soldiers abandoning positions they'd held for years. Civilians fleeing toward western territories with whatever possessions they could carry. Supply wagons clogging roads designed for half the traffic. Lucien rode through it all, visible, present, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Leadership during catastrophe wasn't about having answers. It was about not looking as terrified as everyone else, even when terror was the only rational response. By nightfall, the main forces had reached Ravenscar. It was smaller than Thornridge, less impressive. Walls that had been built for local defense rather than territorial dominance. But it was defensible if you didn't care about glory. And Lucien had finally learned that glory without function was just expensive decoration waiting to shatter. He walked the ramparts after midnight, checking positions, talking to soldiers who looked at him with expressions that ranged from doubt to cautious hope. 6 months ago, these men had believed in his legend. Now they believed in his presence. It was a smaller faith, more fragile, but at least it was real. General Hartwick found him on the eastern wall, watching torchlight from the advancing Solmeyer forces flicker in the distance like fallen stars. "They'll be here by morning," the general said. "I know," Lucian replied. "You ready?" "No," Lucian said honestly, "but I stopped waiting to be ready months ago." Hartwick stood beside him in silence for a while. "Your father used to say that war reveals what men are actually made of," he said finally. "Strip away the titles and the reputation and the borrowed glory, and what's left is just truth." Lucian watched the distant fires. "What do you think is left of me?" he asked. The general considered this carefully. 6 months ago, I would have said nothing, he admitted. Just empty space where competence should have been. But you've changed, slowly, painfully. Not enough to save the Empire, but maybe enough to save yourself. "That's something," Lucian said. "It's more than most men manage," Hartwick replied. Dawn came cold and gray with fog, thick enough to hide the approaching army, until they were close enough that you could hear metal scraping against leather and horses breathing hard after the night march. Lucian stood on the walls in full armor that felt heavier than it used to. Not because the armor had changed, but because he finally understood the actual weight of leadership, when borrowed competence wasn't carrying it for you. The Solmeyer forces assembled in the valley below with terrifying efficiency. Professional. Organized. Led by commanders who knew exactly where every weakness existed in northern defenses. Because Evelyn had told them. For a moment, watching enemy banners snap in the morning wind, Lucian felt something that might have been grief or might have been understanding. This wasn't betrayal. This was consequences. 5 years of systematic erasure had produced exactly the response it deserved. A horn sounded from the enemy lines. Not an attack signal, a parley request. Hartwick appeared beside him. "They want to talk," he said. "Probably offering surrender terms," Lucien said. "You going to accept?" Lucian looked at the old general. "What would my father do?" "Your father would have rejected any terms that diminished his authority," Hartwick said. Pride mattered more to him than survival. "And what would you do?" Lucian asked. The general was quiet for a moment. "I'd listen," he said, "because sometimes the difference between wisdom and stupidity is just knowing when you're actually beaten." Lucien nodded slowly. "Set up the pavilion," he said. "White flags. Full diplomatic protocol." "You sure about this?" Hartwick asked. "No," Lucian said, "but I stopped being sure about anything months ago." The parley pavilion went up in the neutral ground between the two forces, white canvas snapping in the wind. Guards from both sides watching each other with the careful attention of men who might be killing each other within hours. Lucian rode down with minimal escort, just Hartwick and 2 guards. No ceremonial display, no theatrical demonstration of power, just a man meeting his consequences directly. He dismounted and walked into the pavilion. Inside, 2 people waited. The first was a Solmeyer general he didn't recognize. Gray-haired and professional with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years turning strategy into reality. The second was Evelyn. She wore midnight blue, military cut, practical rather than decorative, her hair pulled back severely. An intelligence officer's insignia visible on her collar. She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Harder somehow. More present. Like someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for existing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the Solmeyer general broke the silence. "Duke Mordain, I'm General Castaigne, Senior Military Commander for the Eastern Campaign. I believe you know Director Evelyn Ashford." Lucian noticed she'd dropped his name, reclaimed her family identity. That was fine. She'd earned the right to discard anything associated with him. "Director," he said carefully. Eveline met his eyes without expression. "Duke Mordain." Her voice was professional, distant. The voice of someone conducting business with a stranger rather than speaking to a husband. Former husband in every way that mattered. General Castaigne gestured toward the table where maps had been laid out showing the northern territories in precise detail. "We're here to discuss terms," he said. "Specifically, your surrender and the peaceful transition of Northern Command to Solmeyer authority." Lucian looked at the maps, recognized Evelyn's work immediately in the careful notation and strategic marking. She'd always been meticulous. "What terms?" he asked. Castaigne outlined them methodically. Lucian would retain his title and his castle, keep enough lands to maintain dignity, live quietly under Solmeyer oversight for the rest of his life. In exchange, he would surrender all military authority. Seedy border territories. Accept permanent occupation forces. Essentially become exactly what Hartwick had predicted months ago. An expensive decoration with no actual power. It was humiliating and practical, and probably the best outcome available given the circumstances. Lucien listened without interrupting. When Castaigne finished, silence filled the pavilion. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "These are generous terms considering the situation," she said quietly. "You fought well at Ravenscar, better than expected. But you can't win this. We both know it." Lucien looked at her, really looked at her in ways he'd failed to do for 5 years. She'd become someone formidable, someone who commanded respect through actual competence rather than borrowed reputation. Everything he'd pretended to be, she actually was. "You planned all this," he said. "Not an accusation, just observation." "I provided intelligence," Evelyn corrected. "Solmeyer made their own strategic decisions. But you knew how it would unfold." "I knew where the weaknesses were," she said. "I built most of them. Exploitation was inevitable once I wasn't there to compensate for them anymore." Lucien nodded slowly. "I've been studying," he said. "The cipher. Military theory. Strategic analysis. Everything I should have learned years ago instead of stealing your work." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I know," she said. "We've been monitoring your communications. Your coded messages are still terrible, but they're improving. Given another 5 years, you might actually become competent." "Will I have 5 years?" Lucien asked. "That depends on whether you accept these terms." Lucien looked down at the maps showing territories his family had controlled for 3 generations. Lands that would now belong to someone else. Power that would transfer to people who'd actually earned it. He thought about his father, about the empire built on strategic brilliance that had taken 40 years to construct, about how completely he'd destroyed it in a decade through arrogance and stupidity, about how the only reason anything had survived those 10 years was the woman standing across from him who'd worked invisibly to prevent total collapse. "I have a counteroffer," he said. Castaigne and Evelyn exchanged glances. "You're not in a position to negotiate," the general said. "I know," Lucien replied. "But hear me out anyway." He took a breath. "I accept your terms, all of them. Surrender of military authority, territorial concessions, occupation oversight, everything." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then what's the counteroffer?" "One request," Lucien said. "Personal rather than political. It won't change the strategic outcome. Won't affect Solmeyer's position. It's just for me." "What request?" Evelyn asked carefully. "Teach me," Lucien said. The pavilion went very quiet. "Teach you what?" Evelyn said. "Everything," Lucien replied. "The cipher, strategic analysis, intelligence assessment, all the things I should have learned instead of taking credit for your work. I'm not asking to be reinstated. Not asking for power back, just asking for knowledge." "Why?" Evelyn asked. "Because I spent 35 years believing I was something I wasn't," Lucien said. "And I'd like to spend whatever years I have left becoming something real, even if it's less impressive than the fiction." Castaigne looked at Evelyn with an expression that suggested this was her decision. She studied Lucien for a long time. He couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she was considering the request or calculating how to refuse it diplomatically. Finally, she spoke. "No," she said quietly. The word hit harder than Lucien expected. He'd prepared himself for rejection, had known it was likely. But hearing it still felt like a door closing permanently on any possibility of redemption. "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do," Evelyn interrupted. "You're asking me to teach you the skills I spent 5 years using to hold your empire together while you took credit and ignored me. You're asking me to invest more invisible labor into making you competent after you spent a decade proving you don't value that labor." She leaned forward. "Why would I do that? What possible reason would I have to help you become the person you should have been all along?" Lucien met her eyes. "You wouldn't," he said. "There's no good reason. I'm asking anyway because I have nothing else left to offer except honesty about how completely I failed." "That's not enough," Evelyn said. "I know." She stood up. "General Castaigne will finalize the surrender terms. You'll sign them today. Occupation forces will arrive tomorrow. Your authority ends tonight." Evelyn walked toward the pavilion exit. Lucien watched her go, feeling something final settle into place. This was how it ended. Not with dramatic confrontation or passionate reconciliation or any of the narrative resolution that felt satisfying. Just with consequences arriving exactly as promised. He'd destroyed something that could have been partnership through systematic neglect and casual cruelty. She'd survived that destruction and built something better elsewhere. Those were just facts, simple and permanent. But as Evelyn reached the exit, she paused, turned back. Her expression was unreadable. "There's someone you should meet," she said quietly, "before everything finalizes. Someone who deserves to see what you've become." "Who?" Lucien asked. "Your son." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lucien felt reality tilt sideways. "I don't have a son," he said. Evelyn's expression hardened into something that looked like old pain wrapped in steel. "You have a son," she said. 4 years old. Conceived during the last month before I left. I discovered I was pregnant 2 weeks after crossing the Solmeyer border. Lucien couldn't breathe properly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have used him as leverage," Evelyn said. "Would have demanded his return. Would have turned a child into a political weapon. I wasn't going to let you destroy him the way you destroyed everything else." "Where is he?" Lucien asked. "Safe," Evelyn said. "Raised in Solmeyer with status and protection. He knows who his father is, knows what you did, knows why I left." "What's his name?" Evelyn hesitated. Then she said it. "Marcus. Your father's name," Lucien said quietly. "Yes. Why?" Evelyn's expression softened slightly. "Because your father was flawed, but he tried to be better than his worst impulses. He failed often, but he kept trying. I wanted our son to have that legacy instead of yours." The words cut deeper than intended. Probably exactly as deep as intended. "When can I meet him?" Lucien asked. "After you sign the surrender terms," Evelyn said. "After occupation begins. After you've proven you can accept consequences without trying to negotiate your way out of them." She walked to the exit again. This time she didn't pause. And Lucien stood alone in the pavilion, surrounded by maps showing an empire that no longer belonged to him, learning that the most devastating consequences weren't political or military. They were personal. The empire he'd lost could be rebuilt eventually by someone more competent. The son he'd never known existed couldn't be recovered through strategy or negotiation or any of the borrowed brilliance he'd relied on for years. That loss was permanent. The surrender documents were signed by sunset. Lucien's signature looked shaky even to his own eyes. Not from reluctance, but from the accumulated weight of 6 months learning what failure actually felt like when you couldn't blame anyone except yourself. General Hartwick witnessed the signing with an expression that might have been disappointment or might have been relief that it was finally over. Afterward, standing in the pavilion while Solmeyer officers began coordinating occupation logistics, the old general spoke quietly. "Your father would have rather died than signed those papers," he said. "My father died anyway," Lucien replied. "At least I'm still alive to try being better." "Better than what?" "Better than the person I was yesterday," Lucien said. "It's not a high bar, but it's the only one available." Hartwick almost smiled. "What happens now?" he asked. "I meet my son," Lucien said. "Apparently I have a son." The general's eyebrows rose. "Since when?" "Since I wasn't paying attention," Lucien said, "which seems consistent with everything else." He walked out of the pavilion into the cooling evening air. Solmeyer soldiers were already moving through the camp with professional efficiency, taking positions, establishing authority, converting enemy territory into occupied space with the smooth machinery of an empire that actually knew how to govern. Lucien watched them work and felt something strange that might have been respect. They were good at this. Better than his forces had ever been, probably because they valued competence over reputation. A messenger approached as he reached his tent. "Director Ashford requests your presence," the young soldier said. "She's waiting at the eastern perimeter with someone who wants to meet you." Lucien followed the messenger through camp to where Evelyn stood beside a supply wagon, talking quietly with a woman he didn't recognize, and holding the hand of a small boy with dark hair and gray eyes that looked exactly like Evelyn's. The child watched Lucien approach with the careful attention of someone who'd been told to observe rather than trust. Lucien stopped a few feet away. He'd spent 35 years believing he knew what power looked like. Armies, castles, reputation, control. But standing there looking at a 4-year-old boy who carried his bloodline but not his name, Lucien finally understood what power actually meant. The ability to shape a life, to influence who someone becomes, to matter in ways that outlasted military victories and political maneuvering. And he'd lost that power completely through choices that seemed insignificant at the time, but compounded into permanent consequences. "Marcus," Evelyn said quietly, "this is Duke Lucien Mordain." The boy looked up at her. "My father," he said. Not a question, just confirmation of facts he already knew. "Yes," Evelyn said. Marcus turned back to Lucien and studied him with disconcerting intensity for someone so young. Then he spoke with the blunt honesty of children who haven't learned that some truths are supposed to stay hidden. Mother says you were a bad husband, but you're trying to be better now. Lucien felt something crack in his chest. Your mother is right, he said carefully, about both things. Are you going to hurt her again? Marcus asked. No, Lucien said. I'm not going to have the opportunity. The boy considered this. Good, he said. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. I don't want her to cry anymore. Eveline's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Lucien knelt down slowly so he was eye level with his son. I'm sorry I made her cry, he said. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry about a lot of things that can't be fixed. Can you try to fix them anyway? Marcus asked. I can try, Lucien said, but trying doesn't always work. Mother says trying matters even when it fails, the boy said. Your mother is smarter than I am, Lucien replied. Marcus nodded seriously. I know, he said. Everyone knows that. The simple truth of it hit harder than any military defeat. A 4-year-old could see what Lucien had missed for 5 years. That Eveline was brilliant and competent and everything he'd pretended to be. That recognizing her value wasn't complicated. It just required paying attention. Eveline spoke quietly. That's enough for now, she said. Say goodbye. Marcus looked up at Lucien. Will I see you again? He asked. I don't know, Lucien said honestly. Do you want to? Lucien felt his throat tighten. Yes, he said, more than anything. Then you probably will, Marcus said with the confident certainty of children who still believed wanting something hard enough could make it real. He let go of Eveline's hand and did something completely unexpected. He hugged Lucien, just wrapped small arms around his neck and held on tight enough that Lucien could feel the boy's heartbeat against his chest. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then Marcus pulled back and returned to Eveline's side. She picked him up without a word and carried him back toward the supply wagon where the unknown woman waited. Lucien stayed kneeling in the dirt, watching them leave, understanding that he'd just experienced the most important moment of his entire life. Not a military victory, not a political triumph, just 5 seconds of connection with a son who'd every reason to hate him but chose temporary forgiveness instead. The thing about consequences is that sometimes they arrive wearing unexpected faces. Sometimes they look like surrender documents. Sometimes they look like occupied territories. And sometimes they look like a 4-year-old boy who barely knows you but hugs you anyway, because children are better at grace than adults will ever be. Lucien stood up slowly, his knees protesting, and walked back toward his tent. Tomorrow, the occupation would begin officially. Tomorrow he would start living as something less than the legend he'd built on stolen brilliance. Tomorrow, everything would change permanently. But tonight, he had a memory. One moment of connection with a son who represented everything he'd lost through carelessness and cruelty and systematic failure to see the people who mattered most. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just a small crack in the door that had closed permanently 6 months ago. And maybe, if he tried hard enough, if he learned fast enough, if he became someone actually worth knowing instead of just someone good at pretending, maybe that crack could widen eventually into something real. It was a fragile hope. The kind that would probably shatter under the weight of reality, but it was the only hope available. And men who'd lost everything learned quickly that fragile hope was better than none at all. Lucien entered his tent and sat down at the small desk where 6 months of desperate study had turned him from complete incompetence into barely functional adequacy. Tomorrow he would face occupation and loss of authority and the final collapse of borrowed greatness. But tonight he picked up a pen and began writing a letter to his son. The first of what he hoped would be many. Even if Marcus never wanted to read them, even if Eveline threw them away unopened, even if every word was just another exercise in futile gesture toward redemption that would never actually arrive. Because the thing about trying to be better was that you had to try even when success seemed impossible, especially when success seemed impossible. That was the only difference between someone genuinely changing and someone just waiting for conditions to improve enough that change became unnecessary. Outside his tent, occupation forces continued their work. Inside, a former duke who'd spent a decade pretending to be someone he wasn't finally began the harder work of becoming someone real. And in the Solmeyer camp, Eveline held her sleeping son and stared into darkness, wondering if the man she'd left in ruins 6 months ago could actually become the person he'd promised to be. Or if some damage was simply permanent. Time would tell. But time had a way of revealing exactly who people actually were when every comfortable lie had been stripped away. And the truth, when it finally arrived, rarely looked like anyone expected. The occupation of Blackthorn Castle began at dawn with the efficiency of an empire that understood how to convert conquest into governance. Solmire soldiers moved through corridors that had belonged to the Mordain family for 3 generations, replacing banners, establishing checkpoints, transforming a seat of power into administrative territory with the smooth machinery of people who'd done this before. Lucien watched from his study window as the transition happened in real time. He'd been allowed to keep his private quarters, a concession to dignity rather than power. The rest of the castle now functioned under Solmire authority, with protocols and procedures that had nothing to do with him. It was strange watching your empire get dismantled piece by piece while you stood there unable to stop it. Not because you were restrained, because you'd agreed to it. Because fighting would have meant more death and destruction without changing the fundamental outcome. Sometimes surrender was the most honest choice available. That didn't make it comfortable, just necessary. General Hartwick arrived mid-morning carrying documents that required signatures, transfer protocols, resource inventories, all the bureaucratic machinery that converted defeat into official record. "You holding up?" the old general asked. Lucien looked at the papers without touching them. "I'm still here," he said. "That's something." "It's more than your father managed," Hartwick replied. "He would have done something dramatic and gotten himself killed rather than accept this." "Was he right or was I right?" Lucien asked. Hartwick set the papers down on the desk. "You're both alive to ask that question," he said. "Your father isn't. That probably answers it." Lucien signed the documents without reading them too carefully. The details didn't matter anymore. He'd surrendered authority completely. Everything else was just administrative cleanup. "What happens to you now?" he asked Hartwick. The general shrugged. "Solmire offered me a position, advisory role in Northern Transition. Apparently they value experience over loyalty." "You going to take it?" "Probably," Hartwick said. "I'm 64 years old, too old to start over somewhere else. Too young to retire into irrelevance." He paused. "You could do the same. They'd probably take you on as a consultant. You know the territory, know the noble houses. Could be useful during integration." Lucien shook his head. "I'm done being useful to empires I didn't build," he said. "If I'm going to contribute something, it should be something actually mine." "Like what?" Lucien gestured at the books covering his desk. Military theory, strategic analysis, cipher documentation he'd been studying for 6 months. "Knowledge," he said. "Real knowledge instead of borrowed brilliance. It's slower and less impressive, but at least it's honest." Hartwick studied him for a moment. "You really have changed," he said. 6 months ago you would have been scheming, looking for angles, trying to negotiate your way back into relevance. 6 months ago I still believed I deserved relevance," Lucien replied. "Now I'm just trying to earn it." The general nodded slowly. "Your father never learned that lesson," he said. "Spent his whole life believing his birthright made him special. Died angry that the world didn't agree." He walked toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you'll be a better man than he was. Eventually. If you keep trying." "How long is eventually?" Lucien asked. "However long it takes," Hartwick said. "There's no timeline for becoming someone worth respecting." He left. Lucien sat alone in his study, surrounded by the debris of borrowed greatness, and tried to figure out what came next. The honest answer was that he didn't know. For 35 years, his identity had been built around power and reputation, and the comfortable fiction that he deserved both. Now that fiction had collapsed completely, what remained was just a man who'd spent a decade stealing credit and 6 months trying to learn what competence actually required. That wasn't much of a foundation, but it was more honest than what he'd built before. And honesty, he was learning, mattered more than impressiveness. The first letter from Marcus arrived 3 weeks into the occupation. It came through official Solmire correspondence channels, which meant Eveline had approved it, which meant she was at least allowing minimal contact. That was something. Small, fragile, but something. Lucien opened it carefully, trying not to let hope build too high before seeing what was actually written. The handwriting was a child's, large letters, uneven spacing, words that hadn't quite mastered spelling yet. "Dear Duke Lucien, Mother says I can write to you if I want. I want to know about the castle. Is it big? Do you have horses? What do you do all day?" I told my friend Matthias that my father is a duke. He said dukes are powerful. Are you powerful? Mother says you used to be, but now you're learning to be something better. What does that mean? Your son Marcus. Lucien read it 4 times. Then he sat down and wrote a response. He spent 2 hours on it. trying to find words that would be honest but not overwhelming. That would answer a 4-year-old's questions without dumping adult complications onto someone too young to process them. It was harder than any military strategy he'd ever attempted. Dear Marcus, the castle is big, but it's not mine anymore. Other people run it now. I still live here, but mostly in my study where I keep books. We have horses, 23 of them. Maybe someday you could visit and meet them. What I do all day is study. I'm learning things I should have learned a long time ago. Your mother was right that I used to be powerful, but not in good ways. Now I'm trying to be powerful in ways that actually matter. That means being honest, being kind, being someone you might not be ashamed of when you're old enough to understand what I did wrong. I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm trying. Your father. He sent it through the same official channels. Didn't know if Marcus would write back. Didn't know if this fragile connection would survive past one exchange. But trying mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. That was something he'd learned from 6 months of failure. That effort had value independent of results. The autumn passed slowly. Blackthorn Castle settled into its new identity as a Solmire administrative center. The occupation forces integrated smoothly with the local population. Life continued with the strange normalcy of people adapting to change because the alternative was chaos. Lucien existed on the margins of it all, not imprisoned, not free, just present. He attended occasional meetings when Solmire administrators needed historical context about the Northern Territories, answered questions about noble house relationships and traditional protocols, made himself useful in small ways that didn't require authority. It was humbling work, the kind that erased ego rather than feeding it. But humility, he was discovering, felt more sustainable than borrowed greatness ever had. Marcus's letters continued, one every 2 weeks, short, simple, filled with a child's observations about daily life in the Solmire capital. Lucien answered each one carefully, never pushing, never demanding more connection than was offered, just maintaining the thread that kept them linked across the distance. In the 4th letter, Marcus asked a harder question. Dear Duke Lucien, Mother cried again last night. I heard her through the wall. When I asked why, she said it was about old sadness. Did you make her sad? Will she always be sad? Your son, Marcus. Lucien stared at that letter for an hour before responding. Finally, he wrote something that felt true even though truth was uncomfortable. Dear Marcus, yes, I made your mother very sad. For a long time. Because I didn't see how valuable she was, and I took credit for her work, and I treated her like she didn't matter. I can't fix that. The past stays broken no matter how much you want to repair it. But maybe the sadness will get smaller over time. Maybe someday she'll remember the bad parts less and the good parts more. I hope so. Because she deserves to be happy. She's the smartest person I ever met, and I was too stupid to realize it until she left. If you can make her smile, that matters more than anything I could do from here. Your father. He sent it knowing it might be too heavy for a 4-year-old. But Marcus had asked an honest question. He deserved an honest answer. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the northern mountains by late October, turning everything white and quiet and somehow cleaner than it had been before. Lucien spent most days in his study, reading, studying, working through military theory that was finally starting to make sense after months of struggle. He wasn't brilliant, would never be brilliant, but he was competent now in ways that felt earned rather than stolen. That was enough. On the first day of December, an unexpected visitor arrived. The servant who announced her looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure whether this required formal protocol or something else entirely. Director Ashford is here, he said carefully. She requests a private meeting. Lucien's heart kicked against his ribs. Eveline hadn't visited once since the occupation began, hadn't sent personal correspondence, hadn't acknowledged him except through official channels regarding Marcus's letters. Her presence now meant something had changed. He just didn't know if that change was good or catastrophic. Show her in, he said. The servant left. Lucien stood up, suddenly aware of how shabby his study looked. Books stacked everywhere, papers covering every surface. The organized chaos of someone who'd spent 6 months cramming education that should have taken years. He didn't have time to clean it. The door opened. Eveline entered wearing dark blue and practical boots designed for winter travel. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. Her face looked tired but not broken. She'd survived him. That was clear immediately. Whatever damage he'd done hadn't been permanent enough to destroy her completely. That was something. She looked around the study, taking in the books and papers and evidence of desperate learning. You've been busy, she said. Trying to be, Lucien replied. She walked to his desk and picked up one of the cipher texts he'd been working through. Read the marked section for a moment. Set it down without comment. You're improving, she said. Your translation is still rough, but the fundamental understanding is there. It's slower than I want, Lucien admitted. That's because you're actually learning it instead of pretending you already know it, Eveline said. Real education takes time. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt heavy with 6 months of distance and 5 years of accumulated damage and 4 years of a child neither of them had planned. Finally, Eveline broke it. Marcus asks about you constantly, she said. Every other day he wants to know something new. What you look like. What your voice sounds like. Whether you're nice or mean. What do you tell him? Lucien asked. That you're complicated, Eveline said. That you made mistakes, but you're trying to fix them. That people can be both terrible and better at the same time. She looked at him directly. I don't know if that's true. If you're actually changing or just waiting for conditions to improve enough that change becomes unnecessary. How would I prove it? Lucien asked. Time, Eveline said. Years of consistent behavior. Patterns that demonstrate the change is real rather than performed. I don't have years, Lucien said quietly. Why not? Because you're there and I'm here and Marcus is growing up without me, he said. By the time I prove anything, he'll be an adult who barely knows me. Eveline was quiet for a moment. That's the price, she said. You destroyed trust through 5 years of systematic neglect. Rebuilding it takes longer than destroying it. That's just how consequences work. I know, Lucien said. Do you? Eveline asked. Because 6 months ago you came to Solmeyer expecting one conversation to fix everything, expecting your apology to matter enough that I'd return. You still thought the world operated according to your preferences. I was wrong, Lucien said. About what specifically? About thinking I deserve forgiveness, he said. About assuming you needed me. About believing borrowed power was real power. He took a breath. About everything that mattered. Eveline studied him with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reading people accurately. The Empress wants me to return to the capital, she said. There's a position opening in the Intelligence Directorate. Senior level, significant authority. Everything I've worked for. Lucien felt something cold settle in his stomach. When? He asked. 2 months, Eveline said. You should take it, Lucien said. It's what you deserve. I know, Eveline replied. But Marcus asked me something yesterday that I can't stop thinking about. What? He asked if you're his father or if you're just the Duke who used to be married to his mother. The question hit harder than Lucien expected. What did you tell him? He asked. I told him, I don't know yet, Eveline said. That you're trying to be his father, but trying isn't the same as succeeding. What would success look like? Lucien asked carefully. Eveline stood up and walked to the window overlooking the snow-covered training yards. I don't know, she admitted. I spent 5 years hating you, 6 months building a life without you, 4 years raising a son alone because I was terrified of what you'd do if you knew he existed. She turned back. And now you're here writing letters to a child you barely know and studying books you should have mastered years ago and apparently trying to become someone different. Her expression was unreadable. I don't know if redemption is real or if it's just a story people tell themselves to avoid facing permanent consequences. I don't know if you can actually change or if you're just performing change until something better comes along. How do I prove it? Lucien asked again. You can't, Eveline said. Not to me. Not in any time frame that matters. The damage is done. Then why are you here? Lucien asked. Because Marcus deserves better than growing up without a father, she said. And maybe you deserve a chance to be better than the person you were. She walked toward the door, paused, turned back. The Empress approved a proposal, she said quietly. If you want it, a position in Solmeyer, educational role, teaching military history and strategic analysis to intelligence officers. Low level, no authority, but legitimate work using actual knowledge instead of stolen credit. Why would she offer that? Lucien asked. Because she values competence over legacy, Eveline said. And because I asked her to. Why would you ask? Eveline's expression softened slightly. Because our son asks about you every other day, and I'm tired of telling him his father is the Duke who lives alone in a castle studying books. That's not a life. That's just waiting to die. She opened the door. Think about it, she said. You have 2 months to decide. She left. Lucien stood alone in his study, surrounded by books and papers and the wreckage of borrowed greatness, trying to process what had just been offered. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just an opportunity to exist in the same space as his son, to build something real instead of maintaining something broken. It wasn't much, but it was more than he deserved. And maybe that was the point. That grace, when it arrived, rarely looked like what you expected. That second chances came with conditions that required humility rather than entitlement. That fatherhood earned through consistent effort mattered more than fatherhood claimed through biological accident. Lucian sat down at his desk and pulled out fresh paper, started writing a letter. Not to Marcus this time, to Evelyn. It took 3 hours to get the words right, 3 hours to find language that expressed what he needed to say without demanding anything in return. Finally, he wrote something that felt true. Evelyn, thank you. Not for the opportunity, for surviving me, for building something better after I destroyed everything, for giving our son a life that doesn't involve being invisible in someone else's empire. I don't deserve a second chance. I know that. I'm accepting your offer anyway because Marcus deserves a father who's actually present instead of just theoretically related. I don't know if I can be that person, but I'd like to try. Not for me, for him. If you're willing to risk it. Lucian. He sealed the letter and sent it through official channels before he could second-guess himself into paralysis. Then he waited. The response arrived 3 days later. It was shorter than his letter had been. Lucien. Yen. Risk accepted. We'll arrange transport to Solmire after the new year. You'll start teaching in February. Low-level courses. Basic strategy for junior officers. Nothing prestigious. Marcus is excited. Try not to disappoint him. Evelyn. Lucien read it sitting at his desk while winter light filtered through windows overlooking territories that no longer belonged to him. The empire his family had built for 3 generations was gone. The reputation he'd constructed from stolen brilliance was destroyed. The legend of Duke Lucien Mordain existed now only as a cautionary tale about borrowed power and systematic neglect. Everything he thought mattered had collapsed completely. But sitting there holding a letter that offered him nothing except the chance to be present in his son's life, Lucien realized something that should have been obvious years ago. That the things he'd spent 35 years chasing were never actually valuable. Power without competence was just borrowed time. Reputation without substance was just expensive decoration. Authority without genuine contribution was just organized theft. What mattered was smaller, more fragile, harder to maintain. Being seen accurately instead of through carefully constructed fiction. Being valued for actual contribution instead of inherited position. Being present for people who deserved better than absence. It wasn't impressive. Wouldn't make him legendary. Wouldn't restore the empire or repair the damage or erase 5 years of systematic cruelty. But it was real. And real was better than borrowed. Always had been. He'd just been too arrogant to notice. The journey to Solmire happened in January during a cold snap that made travel miserable. Lucien rode in a supply caravan with minimal escort. No ceremonial display. No announcement of importance. Just a former duke who looked increasingly less like a duke with every mile. They crossed the border after 4 days. The guards who'd stopped him 6 months earlier recognized him immediately. Different circumstances this time. Different man. Maybe. They reached the capital on the 8th day. The city looked different in winter. White stone buildings against white snow, everything clean and quiet and somehow more honest than summer grandeur. Evelyn met him at the administrative building where housing had been arranged. She looked tired, older than he remembered, but present in ways she'd never been allowed to be in Blackthorn. This is your quarters, she said, showing him a small apartment near the education district. 2 rooms, basic furniture, nothing impressive. It's more than I need, Lucien said. It's what we allocated, Evelyn replied. Don't read meaning into resource distribution. She handed him a key. Classes start in 3 weeks. Curriculum guidelines are on the desk. Your students will be junior intelligence officers. Smart, ambitious. They'll test you constantly to see if you actually know what you're teaching. I probably don't, Lucien admitted. Then study harder, Evelyn said. This isn't Blackthorn where someone corrected your mistakes invisibly. Here you succeed or fail based on actual competence. I know, Lucien said. She turned to leave, paused. Marcus wants to meet you tomorrow, she said carefully. Real meeting, not just letters. Are you ready for that? No, Lucien said honestly, but I don't think I'll ever be ready. May as well do it anyway. Evelyn almost smiled. 2 o'clock, she said. The garden's near the Eastern Plaza. I'll bring him. You show up. We see what happens. She left. Lucien stood in his small apartment surrounded by basic furniture and curriculum guidelines and the crushing weight of tomorrow's meeting with a son who barely knew him. He'd spent 35 years believing he was special, Now he was just a man with an opportunity to do better than his worst self. That was terrifying. But terror was honest, and honesty was better than comfortable fiction. Always had been. The meeting happened in gardens that looked gray and dormant under winter sky. Lucien arrived early, too nervous to be late, too aware that this moment mattered more than any military campaign or political negotiation he'd ever attempted. Marcus appeared at exactly 2 o'clock, holding Evelyn's hand, wearing a heavy coat that made him look smaller than 4 years old. He saw Lucien and stopped. For a moment, neither moved. Then Marcus spoke with the direct honesty of children who haven't learned social filters yet. "You look sadder than I expected," he said. Evelyn started to correct him, but Lucien spoke first. "I am sad," he admitted, "about a lot of things, but I'm glad you're here." Marcus considered this seriously. "Mother says you're going to teach people about strategy and wars and stuff." "Yes," Lucien said. "Are you good at it?" "I'm learning to be," Lucien replied. "Same as you're learning to read and write." The boy thought about this. Then he let go of Evelyn's hand and walked closer, stopped a few feet away. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Anything," Lucien replied. "Why did you make Mother cry?" The question landed like a blade between the ribs. Lucien knelt down so they were eye level. "Because I was selfish," he said. "I took credit for her work. I ignored her when she needed me to see her. I treated her like furniture instead of a person." He didn't soften it, didn't use language that hid the truth. Marcus deserved honesty, even if honesty was uncomfortable. "That was mean," the boy said. "Yes," Lucien agreed, "very mean. Are you still mean?" "I'm trying not to be," Lucien said. "But trying doesn't always work. Sometimes people stay mean even when they don't want to." Marcus studied him with disconcerting intensity. "Do you want to be my father?" he asked. "More than anything," Lucien said. "Even though I don't know you, especially because you don't know me," Lucien replied. "Because that means I have to earn it instead of just claiming it." Marcus looked back at Evelyn. She nodded slightly. The boy turned back to Lucien. "Okay," he said. "You can try." Then he did something unexpected. He took Lucien's hand, just wrapped small fingers around larger ones, and held on. "Mother says the gardens have fish ponds," he said. "Can we see them?" Lucien felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he managed. They walked through winter gardens together. A former duke and a 4-year-old son, and a woman who'd survived systematic erasure, moving slowly between dormant flower beds and frozen fountains. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, just 3 people existing in the same space without destroying each other. That was progress. Small, fragile, conditional, but progress. Marcus talked constantly, asking questions about everything: the gardens, the fish, the buildings, whether Lucien knew how to ice skate. Lucien answered each question carefully, never pretending knowledge he didn't have, never performing certainty he didn't feel, just being present, actually present. For maybe the first time in his entire life, Evelyn walked beside them silently, watching, evaluating, probably calculating how quickly this fragile arrangement would shatter under the weight of old patterns reasserting themselves. That was fair. Lucien had earned her skepticism through 5 years of consistent failure. Proving otherwise would take longer than one afternoon in frozen gardens. But you had to start somewhere. And starting was better than continuing to pretend distance was acceptable. They stayed until Marcus got cold. Then Evelyn said it was time to go home. The boy hugged Lucien briefly. "Can we do this again?" he asked. "If you want to," Lucien said. "I want to," Marcus replied. They left together, mother and son walking back toward lives that had learned to function without him. Lucien stood alone in the gray gardens watching them disappear. Felt something strange that might have been hope, or might have been terror, or might have been both. This was his life now. No empire, no authority, no borrowed brilliance hiding fundamental inadequacy. Just a small apartment and teaching position, and the tentative possibility of relationship with a son who didn't owe him anything. It wasn't impressive, wouldn't make him legendary, wouldn't restore what he'd lost or repair what he'd destroyed, but it was honest, built on actual effort instead of stolen credit, earned through humility instead of demanded through entitlement, real instead of performed. And real, Lucien was finally learning, mattered more than everything he'd spent 35 years chasing. The first class happened 3 weeks later in a small lecture hall filled with 20 junior intelligence officers who looked skeptical before he even started speaking. They'd heard about him, the disgraced Duke, the man who'd lost an entire territory through incompetence, the legend exposed as fraud. They expected him to be useless. That was fair. He'd spent a decade being useless while someone else did the actual thinking. Lucian stood at the front of the room and did something he'd never done in 5 years of military councils at Blackthorn. He told the truth. "My name is Lucian Mordain," he said, "former Duke of Blackthorn. I'm here to teach you strategic analysis and military intelligence assessment. But first I need to tell you something about my qualifications." The room went quiet. "I don't have any," he continued. "Not real ones. For 10 years I built a reputation as a tactical genius by stealing credit from my wife, who did all the actual work, while I took all the recognition." Someone in the back row coughed. Lucian kept going. "I lost my territory because I never actually learned the skills I claimed to possess. I surrendered to Solmeyer because fighting would have been stupid, and I've been stupid enough for one lifetime." He paused. "I'm teaching this class because Director Ashford thought I might be useful once I stopped pretending and started actually learning. I've spent the last year studying military theory I should have mastered decades ago. I'm competent now, barely. Probably not as competent as some of you already are." Another pause. "But I know what failure looks like from the inside. I know how easy it is to confuse proximity to brilliance with actual brilliance. I know what happens when you build empires on borrowed competence." He looked around the room. "So that's what I'm offering. Not genius, not legend, just hard-won competence from someone who learned it the most humiliating way possible. If that's valuable to you, stay. If not, the door is behind you." Nobody moved. One student in the front row raised her hand. "Why should we trust you?" she asked. "You just admitted you're a fraud." "I'm a former fraud," Lucian corrected. "Currently, I'm just someone who knows what not to do. Sometimes that's more valuable than knowing what to do." He spent the next 2 hours teaching basic intelligence analysis. Nothing sophisticated, just foundational principles about reading enemy communications and identifying strategic patterns. It wasn't brilliant, but it was honest. And several students stayed after to ask questions that suggested they'd actually learned something. That was enough. Small victories built over time mattered more than spectacular performances that collapsed under scrutiny. He was finally learning that. The months passed. Winter turned to spring. Spring turned to summer. Lucian taught his classes, studied constantly to stay ahead of students who were often smarter than him, wrote letters to Marcus twice a week, and received responses that gradually became longer and more personal. Saw his son every Sunday in gardens that slowly filled with flowers and warmth. Eveline attended most of those meetings. Sometimes she talked to him. Sometimes she just watched. Always she maintained distance that felt appropriate rather than cruel. She wasn't punishing him, just protecting herself and Marcus from patterns reasserting themselves. That was wisdom rather than vindictiveness. Lucian respected it, even when it hurt. On the anniversary of his surrender, exactly 1 year after signing documents that transferred northern territories to Solmeyer control, Eveline asked him to meet her alone. Not in the gardens, in her office overlooking the river that ran through the capital's center. She looked different than she had a year ago. More confident, less guarded. Someone who'd finally stopped waiting for the next disaster. "Sit," she said. Lucian sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eveline pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. "Divorce papers," she said. "Final dissolution of marriage. I had them drawn up months ago, but never filed them." "Why not?" Lucian asked. "Because I wasn't sure if ending it legally mattered when it was already over in every way that counted," she said. She paused. "But I'm filing them now, not because I'm angry, because we both deserve clarity instead of ambiguous legal status that serves no purpose." Lucien looked at the papers without touching them. "I understand," he said. "Do you?" Eveline asked. "Yes," Lucian said. "You're closing a chapter that should have ended a year ago. That's not cruelty. That's just accuracy." Eveline studied him carefully. "You really have changed," she said. "A year ago you would have argued, would have tried to negotiate, would have treated this as something to fight instead of something to accept." "A year ago I was still pretending consequences were negotiable," Lucien said. He signed the papers without hesitation, slid them back across the desk. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting me know Marcus," Lucian said. "For giving me a chance to be something other than the worst version of myself. For surviving me well enough that there was something left worth building from." Eveline's expression softened slightly. "You're welcome," she said quietly. She stood up, walked to the window. "Marcus asked me yesterday if you were going to disappear," she said. "What did you tell him?" Lucian asked. "I told him I don't think so," Eveline said. "That you seem committed to staying, that your patterns have been consistent for a year, which suggests genuine change rather than performance. She turned back. "Don't make me a liar," she said. "I'll try not to," Lucien replied. "Trying isn't enough," Eveline said. "Actually succeeding is what matters." "I know," Lucien said. She walked toward the door, paused. "There's a position opening next year," she said. "Senior instructor, real authority, teaching advanced strategy to experienced officers. They asked if you'd be interested." "Am I qualified?" Lucien asked. "Not yet," Eveline said. "But you could be if you keep working, if you keep learning, if you stop being satisfied with barely competent and push toward actually good." "I'll work for it," Lucien said. "Good," Eveline replied. She left. Lucien sat alone in her office overlooking the river that cut through Solmeyer's heart, holding divorce papers that made official what had been true for years. The marriage was over. The empire was gone. The legend was destroyed. Everything he'd built on borrowed brilliance had collapsed completely. But sitting there in late afternoon light, filtering through windows that overlooked a city that wasn't his, Lucien realized something profound. That losing everything had taught him what actually mattered. Not power, not reputation, not the comfortable fiction of inherited greatness, just the daily work of showing up, of being present, of earning respect through consistent effort instead of demanding it through position, of being a father to a son who barely knew him but was willing to try, of being competent at something real instead of performing brilliance he'd never possessed, of being honest about failure and humble about success and present in ways that required genuine vulnerability. It wasn't impressive, wouldn't restore the empire or repair the damage or make him legendary, but it was his, actually his, built through effort instead of theft, earned through humility instead of arrogance, real instead of borrowed, and real was enough, more than enough. 5 years later, Marcus was 9 years old and asking questions about military history that required actual knowledge to answer properly. They sat together in the gardens that had become their weekly ritual, summer flowers blooming around them, the river flowing steady in the background. Marcus had grown, still small but sharper, more observant, starting to understand complexity instead of just accepting simple answers. "Tell me about Thornridge," he said, "the battle that made you famous." "I wasn't famous for Thornridge," Lucien corrected gently. "Your mother was. I just took credit." "But you planned it," Marcus insisted. "Your mother planned it," Lucien said. "I presented it. There's a difference." The boy thought about this. "That's not fair," he said. "No," Lucien agreed. "It wasn't fair. That's why she left." "But you're better now," Marcus said. "Right. You learned how to do it yourself." "I'm learning," Lucien corrected. "Still learning. Probably always learning. Being competent isn't a destination. It's just consistent work that never really finishes." Marcus leaned against him slightly. They sat that way for a while, father and son watching water move past like time made visible. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "Do you miss being a duke?" he asked. Lucien considered this carefully. 6 years ago, he would have said yes immediately, would have mourned the loss of power and authority and all the borrowed greatness that had defined his identity. Now the answer was more complicated. "I miss the idea of being important," he admitted, "but I don't miss pretending to be someone I wasn't. That was exhausting." "What are you now?" Marcus asked. "Your father," Lucien said. "A teacher. Someone trying to earn respect instead of demanding it. That's smaller than being a duke, but it's more honest." "Is honest better?" the boy asked. "Always," Lucien said, "even when it's harder." They sat together as afternoon faded toward evening and the garden slowly emptied of other visitors. Eventually, Eveline appeared to collect Marcus for dinner. She'd remarried 2 years earlier. A Solmeyer diplomat named Corvin, who treated her with visible respect and put her name on everything they did together. Lucien was happy for her, not in the performative way of someone pretending not to feel loss, in the genuine way of someone who finally understood that her happiness didn't require his proximity, that loving someone sometimes meant accepting they were better off without you. "Ready?" Eveline asked Marcus. The boy stood up, hugged Lucien briefly. "See you next week," he said. "See you next week," Lucien replied. They left together, mother and son walking toward lives that had learned to thrive without depending on him. Lucien sat alone at the gardens as twilight turned everything purple and soft. He was 46 years old, no longer a duke, no longer legendary, no longer anything except what he'd actually earned through 6 years of consistent effort. It was smaller than he'd once imagined his life would be, less impressive than the destiny he'd believed was his birthright, but it was real, built on actual competence instead of stolen credit, maintained through honest work instead of performance, present instead of borrowed. And sitting there in gardens that had witnessed 6 years of slow transformation from entitled fraud to humble teacher, Lucien understood something that had taken most of his life to learn. That greatness built on borrowed brilliance eventually collapses under its own emptiness. That reputation without substance is just expensive decoration waiting to shatter. That fatherhood earned through patient presence matters more than fatherhood claimed through biological accident. That losing everything was sometimes the only way to discover what actually mattered. He'd spent 35 years chasing power and authority and all the comfortable fictions that made him feel special. He'd spent 6 years learning that being real mattered more than being impressive, that showing up mattered more than being brilliant, that consistency mattered more than spectacular performance. And sitting there alone in the quiet gardens as night settled over the city he'd once tried to destroy and failed to destroy because destroying required the same competence he'd never possessed, Lucien finally made peace with the truth that he would never be the person he'd pretended to be. But maybe, after enough years of consistent work, he could become someone worth being, someone his son wasn't ashamed of, someone who'd learned that the hardest battles aren't fought with armies. They're fought with daily choices to be better than your worst self, even when being better is harder than performing greatness. And in the end, after everything collapsed and everyone left and all the borrowed light finally ran out, what remained wasn't empire or legend or any of the things he'd spent a lifetime chasing. Just a man sitting in quiet gardens, finally at peace with being exactly who he actually was. Nothing more. Nothing less. Just real. And real was enough. It had always been enough. He'd just been too arrogant to notice until losing everything taught him what actually mattered. The gardens grew dark around him. Somewhere in the city, his son was laughing over dinner with a mother who'd survived him, and a stepfather who treated her with the respect Lucien had failed to provide. Somewhere in the education district, students were reading assignments he'd carefully prepared because teaching required actual knowledge instead of borrowed brilliance. Somewhere in the distance, the territories he'd lost continued functioning under competent governance that didn't require his participation. Life moved forward whether he mattered or not. That used to terrify him. Now it felt like freedom. The freedom of knowing the world didn't need him to be impressive. It just needed him to be present, honest, real. And finally, after 46 years of borrowed greatness and 6 years of earned humility, Lucien Mordain understood what his father never learned. That the most powerful thing a person can be is simply themselves, without performance, without pretense, without borrowed light hiding fundamental emptiness, just present, just honest, just real. It wasn't impressive, but it was enough, more than enough. It was everything that actually mattered.